Villains can be some of the most compelling characters that can be found within media. There is something so fascinating about an opposing force of nature in which the hero of a story has to defeat or overcome. And despite their evil deeds, they always manage to captivate us, making us even more invested in the story that surrounds them. However, oftentimes you may find that stories may try to push a sympathetic motive to these villains with the sole purpose of attempting to add a layer of complexity and relatability to these characters. The rise of these sympathetic villains can be traced back to the late 1990s with characters such as Count Dracula, a villain with a tragic backstory whose wife took her own life upon receiving false reports of his death, his villainous actions stemming from this tragic event and his desire to be reunited with his wife. However, if we go back to 1897, we get to see a completely different character, a villain who is the personification of evil, someone who indulges in the darkness of a black and white world, a literal monster with no compassion nor mercy, preying on those who are weak while drinking the blood of his victims. This is who Dracula originally was. However, by 1992, a new iteration of this character was introduced within the film Bram Stoker's Dracula, giving him a more tragic backstory and humanizing this villain who was once seen as a monster into a more complex individual who the audience could empathize with. He was no longer this pure evil incarnation, but a character with a motive derived from a tragic past. And honestly, making your villains have these conflicting traits of doing evil as a consequence of a tragic event is not a bad thing. By leading the viewer towards having a more empathetic approach towards these villains, it helps humanize these characters, making them feel more alive and adding this layer of complexity which creates these gray narratives instead of making them solely black or white. Now, that is not to say that all villains need that tragic backstory in order to become complex. There seems to be this preconceiving notion that villains must relate to the audience within some capacity in order to adapt to their character. This mostly being done through eliciting sympathy from some tragic past, which would somewhat justify or create a form of understanding for their current actions. However, there's more to eliciting this feeling of realism onto a villain than simply just making them sympathetic. But before we delve into the factors that go into making a villain feel real and complex, we have to establish a basic foundation as to what makes a good villain. Now, villains can range from being these complex and narrative-driven characters to simple forces of nature, and the same can be said vice versa, so it can be hard to pinpoint what exactly makes a good villain across the board. After all, whether a villain is a competent character or not will depend on how well the author is able to execute them. However, we can still break down the makings of a good villain into these three key components, those being motivation, relationships, and relatability. And I know I'm speaking a bit broadly here, so let me explain what I mean by this. The motivation behind any character is the four-founding structure that lays down the thematic threads behind any story. It is the driving force behind why characters do certain things, and depending on how this is executed, it can either make or break any promising storyline. In essence, the motivation is the key factor that propels characters forward, shaping their decision and driving the narrative throughout the story. Without a clear motivation, characters may risk becoming devoid of depth and purpose. Now, these motivations can be as simple as wanting to be a hero or just wanting to take over the world. However, what matters is the link between the action the villain takes and the motive behind those actions. After all, even if a villain is just evil for the sake of being evil, their actions within the narrative must still align with a discernible motive. And it's this link between the action and motive that allows for villains to be embedded with depth and complexity, providing an insight into their psyche while underscoring the stakes of their conflict with the protagonist. And speaking of the protagonist, let's talk about the relationship between the villain and the force that is meant to oppose them, the hero. Similarly to the villain, the protagonist plays an overarching role in driving the narrative of the story, and for the most part they are the heart of the conflict. They are the characters in which the viewer follows and are made to empathize with, and much like the villain, they do not need to follow or possess any of the common tropes that align with being a hero. On the contrary, more often than not, you may find that heroes who may present themselves as morally ambiguous could offer more in terms of exploring emotions and motivations villains in which the viewer might not have expected to empathize with. It brings forward a new light as to what a hero can be while presenting some very unique narratives. Now, what does any of this have to do with building a well-written villain? Well, through this brief introduction as to what a protagonist is, we can see that the roles between the hero and the villain are fundamentally similar. Everything from the action, climax, and conclusion revolves around their interaction with the world around them and the relationship that they build up throughout the story. It is within these interactions that we gain insight into what the villain truly desires. We get to explore their personalities, motivations, and beliefs, giving depth to not only the villain but also the hero and the surrounding characters. And without these dynamics, any promising narrative can risk becoming a subpar or even generic story. Now, relatability is one of those factors that can make or break any character, because while not every villain needs to be relatable, they still need to feel real or at least grounded in the world in which they were placed in. And this is where sympathy comes in. It's very simple to insert a tragic backstory onto a villain and expect the audience to resonate and sympathize with them and the actions they take to create conflict. Now, don't get me wrong, as I previously stated, sympathy is a powerful emotion that can be used to create very unique and complex villains. As an example, there's Miriam from Hunter x Hunter. Togashi was able to perfectly balance the character of Miriam between being this purely evil creature meant to rule over every other being in this world, while also having this human side to him in which he himself couldn't understand. This internal dichotomy was the perfect formula for creating what I believe to be one of the best villains and villain arcs in all of anime. So being able to relate and sympathize with the villain could offer the chance to create these intricate characters filled with depth and complexity. However, looking at the previous elements as to what makes a good villain, it is clear that sympathy is in all there is to providing depth and complex intricacies onto a character. So now the question goes, how do you create this link of relatability and realism between the audience and the villain without trying to force feed some tragic past with the intention of having the audience sympathize with the villain? Well, to answer that question, let's take a look at a character from the series Chainsaw Man, and I will be going over some aspects of the manga, so do be aware of the following spoilers. Overall, Makima is what I would describe as a complex and unique villain. If you read in between the lines of the Chainsaw Man story, there is a tragic backstory to her character. A devil who was raised by the Japanese government with no free will of her own. Her only aspiration was to create a world where she could be of equal footing with others. However, due to her upbringings, the action she took to try and reach this goal resulted in the deaths of many beloved characters and the breakdown of Denji, the main character. Honestly, her backstory is the perfect encapsulation of what is known as a tragic villain. However, that same backstory isn't really something that is told at face value, and maybe this just speaks volumes on how good of a writer Fujimoto is, but the way in which her backstory is inserted in such a subtle way through dialogue sequences creates this narrative that allows the reader to explore the character of Makima without the focus being her tragic past. And it's this subtlety in her behavior that allows us to understand what type of person she is. And this isn't only done through subtle dialogue, even the action of picking up a pack of cigarettes, lighting one up and coughing right after attempting to smoke one, or being so engrossed into a film and crying right after it ends, adds this layer of realism onto her character, making her feel like an actual person instead of a fictional villain. And it's these little details that we may not notice on our first read or watch that add so much to a story and its characters. Even someone like Griffith from Berserk had these small human moments like getting into water fights or just laughing without a care in the world, making his later actions seem much more villainous and grotesque. Overall, sympathy for the villain is a tool that can be used to really bring out morally gray scenarios and display them in a way that makes us, the viewer, understand the perspective of the villain. However, just because one might not be able to relate to the villain or even empathize with their actions does not make them any less complex of a character. There are many ways to layer a character, and even those who are purely evil by nature can be regarded as complex under the hand of a good writer. And that's going to be the end to this video.